Rear Admiral Bill Schachte. I was assigned the 45 boat, and that commenced my Vietnam time. While I was there, I eventually became the Executive Officer, Operations Officer of Coastal Division 14. And while I was there, we had the bombing halt. And I was told, as everyone else, to do things differently, come up with some new ideas for some different operations. And I came up with what I call the skimmer ops. We get 3 people in a skimmer or skiff, small boat, put them in a red hot area that we had correlated intelligence on either NBA or VC activity. And the purpose was to draw fire. And we double loaded tracer in all the guns. And when I first briefed the division on this plan, I was the executive officer at the time, and I had this kind of groan. You know, we would go on patrol and come in, and I would debrief the boat officers every afternoon. I believe it was like 1600. And that's when they would share intelligence from their patrols, and we would give them the latest, and then they'd go back out the next day. And I told them about this idea of getting 3 people in a small boat, 2 officers and 1 enlisted. And I wanted officers because it's easier to hold an officer responsible, for example, for shooting a clam digger, as opposed to an enlisted person. I just thought that was not fair. And by the way, some of the enlisted folks were, you know, actually better than our officers. So I don't mean to make that implication. So I had 2 officers and an enlisted person who ran the motor. The officers were armed. And when I briefed the division, it was kind of a groan about what, you know. So I then told them, look, I'll be on every one. I'll be the guy forward with the M60. So I'll need 1 volunteer to handle an M60, and we'd scope it every night before we would go out. We'd scope the M16 with starlight. Or I'd use an M14 with infrared if it was not a good night. And Swift would tow the skiff out to the area. We'd get in the boat and go up in the river or whatever, and the Swift would be standing off 10, 15 minutes away, shotgun. On a good night, we'd have a FAC in the air, and they, on occasion, would have an opportunity to preempt anything that was up, but they weren't urgent to come in to assist. And one of those operations got incredible notoriety during a certain campaign with one of the persons who was in my boat. So we were performing those kinds of operations. We also sent some of our boat officers and crews ashore to set up ambushes. Those were not quite successful, although we did have one incident where some of our people were ashore with some swift boats standing by, and it was a long reef area, and they decided to disembark after first light, and were out on the reef. And all of a sudden the water gushed up, and one of the officers thought it was someone with them waiting on the swifts to pick them up. As it turned out, it wasn't. It was a big group of VC, and they had opened fire on our guys. Thankfully, we were very fortunate nobody was hit, and we were able to call in air support, and they had a large number of KIAs. Apparently, the assessment was the person shooting at us was a novice, because they would have known that, you know, we were going to return fire, and there was a large company of BC involved further down in an encampment. This person was apparently set up on this high point to monitor the area to see if, instead of doing that, he opened fire. And so that ended successfully. We had one incident where some guys decided to go into a contested area on a rubber boat, and one of them fell out of the boat, lost his weapon, but we were aggressively trying to do things that we really hadn't done before, and we met with some success on that. Then that was a very long year. It was a long year for all of us. We all have good memories, and memories that aren't so good. And I guess one of the more gratifying things about the whole experience, I got home to my wife and son, mother and father on Christmas Eve. And it was quite a homecoming. My flight had been delayed 14 hours, so everything was, all the reservations that we had were all screwed up, and it's Christmas time. And I'll always remember my mother's voice. I hadn't heard her, my dad, so I had R&R with my wife, but I was in Chicago and telling them I was trying to get from Chicago to Atlanta. My mother got on the phone and said something like, "Hi, honey," and it almost brought me to tears. You know, it was amazing. But that was quite a homecoming. And but there are many stories of Vietnam, many acts of heroism. Well, by history, it should be remembered as a tremendously valiant effort by everybody involved. They all served with courage and honor, and in spite of what someone said under oath to a committee. No, but I thought it was, you would, to see young men, and we were all young, all the officers were volunteers. I think almost all the enlisted folks who served were volunteers. And to do some of the dangerous things that we did in service to our country is something that I thought that story would never be told until, ironically, a certain person ran for president, and a lot of it came out. But I was certainly not in the category of heroes. I mean, but there really were some valiant things done, very heroic things done by swift-boat guys. And interestingly, in country, when we wore that little swift-boat badge, most of us wore all the time the khakis. And we'd go into these places where there were a lot of other people, and you could see the guys packing heat and wearing camouflages, you know, camis and all that, and they'd see that swift-boat button, and that's all they needed to know. I mean, that was, we were pretty well respected by other members of the other services in country. We occasionally would give them a ride just to show them it. And one of those ended in not a good situation, but so it was an incredible experience. And to put, as far as the officer community is concerned, to put a young man in position of command, and it was so hard. You were a small boat, small crew, but you always had to be in charge. You always, and the crew had to know that. And but yet you had to get along. And the best cook from the crew was the cook, and oftentimes that was the officer. It was that kind of collegiality that went on with the firm, you know, chain of command, as it were. So that was a challenge to young officers, and I often thought that we had to make more critical decisions than men out driving destroyers and stuff. But they would not give us a command to see button. And we had a little button that was, you know, officer in charge button. And I understand the rationale for that was that we did not write fitness reports on other officers. You know, we were the only guys there.